So thank you for coming and doing this discussion.
How good is this? I'm so glad. Like, I'm in Sydney, I was able to actually come and talk because we were going to do this over Skype. So I'm glad we can actually do it in person. It's great.
Yeah, no, I didn't realise you lived like relatively close, so.
I'm down for a little bit. So back up to Queensland next week if the borders are open.
Okay, so I followed you for a little while now since you were that vegan Aussie bloke.
Wow, that's OG.
Yeah, I was there from the beginning.
That's awesome.
And then obviously it's transformed now to plant-based logic. Did you just want to tell us a little bit about your activism and what you focus on? Then I can say a bit about myself.
Absolutely, yeah. So my activism is sort of like, I've used this term a lot and people get really sick of it hearing it, but it's like, I always say like activism is a train of many carriages. And I've tried to find a different way. So when I got onto Instagram, which was like 7 years ago, it was all just dead animals. I just scrolled down the Instagram feed and it was just dead animal, dead animal, dead animal. And I was going, oh, this is really depressing. Like, it was really sad. Because obviously, as vegans, we want to get the word out. Yeah. This is what's happening to animals. And that's the reality. And I thought, what we need is some humor. And then it started as like some humor for vegans just to laugh at ourselves, some sort of joke. And then I started getting some traction with meat eaters. In fact, it got to a point where it was 50-50. I had as many meat eaters following me as I did like sort of non-vegans, if you will, than vegans. And then I started finding that comedy was a really good way of sort of getting through people's defenses.
Yeah,
and
I definitely see that. I think there's something I think the word's transcendent, like transcending about comedy. If something is funny, it doesn't matter how theoretically, it shouldn't matter how offensive it is or how much it might relate to you or be attacking you. If it's funny, it kind of just, that's what it is. So I think that's part of the reason why your Instagram has been so successful over the years. And it's so great that, you know, you're talking about 50-50 meat eaters and then vegans as well, because social media people I talk to always say that if you're not getting at least half dislikes on your video or on something, you're not reaching a new audience.
It's a good point. It's a good point. We fall into that echo chamber.
Right.
Vegans are like, because we don't want to feel criticized. We don't want people hating us. So we try to surround ourselves with people who like us and give us, yeah, you're doing good.
Yeah.
As opposed to having those difficult conversations and reaching a different audience.
Yeah.
That's why your channel's so good, and I've been really enjoying your content because you are sort of challenging the status quo. You're trying to throw different aspects out there that not everybody's going to agree with, and you get to have those really good conversations with people. So
yeah, absolutely. I think I'm an acquired taste, that's for sure.
Hey, I've got to underline my humor. Like when it's just funny, my memes are what I find funny. Like there's some people look at it and go, "That's not funny, bro." So it's like I get it. Maybe I'm acquired taste as well.
No,
so.
Most of them are pretty on point.
You just got my sixth sense of humor. That's all it is. That's right.
No, the sense of humor thing is really important. I don't know if you've seen Carnage Swallowing the Past. It's like a mockumentary made by Simon Amstell, and it's set in the future, and it's one of the few, like apart from you and that mockumentary, there isn't many people using humor, which is unfortunate because maybe they do here and there, but yours is like, most of your material is based on comedy, so I think that's fantastic, and I agree it is a way to penetrate the masses.
I think TikTok's going to be really interesting for the vegan community. I know there's a lot of vegan TikTokers out there now that are doing some really funny things. I think there's Zachary Bird. I think there's a couple of really funny ones. I can't think right now, sorry, can't shout you all out, but I think that is going to start evolving, more skit comedy. It all goes back to normalizing veganism in my mind. This is normal. Like, you know, I'm 34-year-old male Aussie guy. This is normal, be vegan. So that's that whole concept, is just, I find comedy normalizes things. Whereas if you kind of radicalize things or you look a certain way, like, oh, the big muscly guy is like, oh, what if you're not a big muscly guy, you know? When I'm not on Instagram and not doing my small little YouTube, I'm a school teacher. So I'm having these conversations with kids as well. And what I've realized is like, you've got to be very careful you don't say things that upset the masses. But what you realize is that kids are very receptive to that. Right. And you're just sort of talking to them and you don't even say anything and they say, I love animals, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. And without even saying anything, we're all taught to be harmful to animals. It's ridiculous. So have you found places in like scope for activism in your teaching? Because you just said you had people complain. Like, was that from you talking about veganism or? Yeah, so I've got a actually I've got a video that I use. I'll flick it to you actually. It's a really good one where it's a young kid who's got a pet pig. Yeah. And it's called Pig with High Heels. So I'll be doing a video about that. That's bacon, you know. That's ham. You got a ham sandwich.
Is that what you said to the student?
Yeah, I said that because they say in there, they go, do you eat him for food? And one of the kids goes, what do they mean? Does they eat his pig? Like, why do they say does he eat his pets?
Oh, and you told them.
And I said, well, that's bacon. That's ham.
Yeah.
So is that sort of like just like subtle activism with kids? I mean, you've got to be careful. You're in a government institution. There's certain things you can and can't say.
Yeah. Without
obviously copying a lot of criticism. I mean, I've got a lot of, when we do food pyramid stuff, I talk to kids about, plant-based milks and those sorts of things. The kids will say, hey, why are you not eating pizza? Or like they'll ask me questions like that. And I'll go, I'm vegan, and we can have those conversations. But yeah, it's more subtle activism with kids, and they don't need much. They just put that little...
They already don't want to harm animals.
Exactly. No kid wants to hurt an animal.
It's interesting, the classroom and TikTok both reaching places where young people are, because that's that kind of the future, and they're...
It's a good point.
Yeah.
It's a good point.
Yeah, so as you know, I'm a qualified lawyer. I was practicing for a little while. That didn't work out so much. So now I'm transitioning into academics, writing a thesis on animal rights at the University of Sydney, and also growing my social media. So those are the two sort of goals that I have. Kind of trying to combine social media with academics, I think, is a powerful way, and a lot of other thinkers have done that successfully. So it's a long-term kind of goal. So I'm working towards that. As you know, I'm not an animal rights lawyer, because in my mind there is nothing, you can't be an animal rights lawyer because all animal law is animal welfare. So I don't want to celebrate when chicks are gassed instead of grinded, because when you're an animal welfare lawyer, that's the type of thing you're advocating for.
Hashtag RSPCA, yo. What the hell is that?
I know, like if some people can do it and if they think that's good, I don't think it is. I think it just reinforces the status of animals as property, as subservient to humans, has always been their importance being judged in their relationship to humans, not independently on their own. So yeah, that's why I'm not because I get that question a lot. Oh my God, you're a lawyer, you must be, working for Voiceless International or something like that. It's like, no, I couldn't do that because it's counterproductive to everything that we're trying to achieve for non-human animals.
I think it's like drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is a moral baseline, and that's how I see veganism. Veganism to me is a moral baseline.
It's interesting that you bring up moral baseline, because there is this interesting dichotomy or like discussion, especially in philosophy, like some of the more philosophical YouTubers often have this debate about what is a moral virtue and what is a moral obligation. And I think most people right now would agree that not causing harm is the moral obligation, but people treat activism as a moral virtue. But where we are in society, like the degree of harm being done to animals, I think it has become, and has been for a long time, a moral obligation to speak out. I don't know, this whole like veganism is a moral baseline. I don't think it is. Like I think the moral baseline is helping now. Maybe if animals weren't harmed to the degree that they are, it would be, just virtuous. Like that's a good thing you're doing. But now I think it's absolutely necessary. It's like walking past a drowning dog or a drowning child. Not doing anything, that's not a baseline. What
does that sort of look like? Now, does that mean that we're far out screaming at people on the streets, throwing blood? Is that what we're doing? Or is it posting a picture of a beautiful vegan dish? Like, what is your obligation? Is it to be out screaming, or is it to be sort of doing what you can? It's a very interesting sort of concept, and effective activism, which we'll probably talk about later.
Do you want to talk about that now?
Let's do it.
I think this is a good time for a comment. Okay, so your question is yes. So you sort of agree that it is a moral obligation to actively help non-human animal victims just because of the scale of harm being done to them. So now the question becomes, what does that look like? What is effective activism? I'm sort of at the stage now where there's two ways to look at it. There's like a large scale, what has worked for other previous movements, and should we base a lot of our activism on that? So we can look at that collectively, and then individually as well, because I don't expect a very introverted, not very confident, fluent person to, I don't know, do a speech or something like this, or put together a marketing team like how we joked to before that needs to be coordinated on like a very high level. So there's also the question of
individualism.
So if you're an amazing cook and you can cook better than 90% of the world, I wouldn't say, no, you should be talking about animal rights, you know what I mean? So there's those two kind of things. So maybe we could unpack the first one in terms of historically what has worked and whether you think that could apply here. You mentioned the marketing thing before, which I thought was a fantastic idea. Yeah,
so my sort of thinking is bigger. So I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of sort of listening to other vegans. So you fall into that echo chamber and sort of, lack of a better word, call it the vegan circle jerk, where you go out and you sort of these massive things. Now, I'm not bagging on people who are activists and they're out on the streets and they're doing, because I think there is a space. But I think what's going to be the long-term effect? Where are we going to get the most bang for our buck, if you will. And that's where that whole concept of hiring maybe a marketing team to sort of show that, hey, veganism is cool, it's normal. But from an individual level, I think that really comes back to what you're comfortable with. Now, I think vegan shaming is a huge problem in the vegan community. I see it all the time. You're not doing enough. Why aren't you out there? You should be out there doing this, you should be out there doing that. I think you should find what you're good at and really stick to that and hit it hard. But to be fair, like, I mean, I've been vegan almost 11 years. The irony of the situation is that veganism actually makes up a very small part of my life. Even though I run a vegan Instagram account, what I mean by that is I've got so many other interests than I do that it's hard. I feel bad because I want to be doing more for the animals. So I think that, it's about going back to effective activism. It's about getting as many people on side as you can. Building an army, lack of a better word. So what does that look like?
Let's unpack some of the specific forms of very popular activism now and why, not necessarily that they're not working, but perhaps they've, what do you call it when you've ran the race, like you've expired, you've used it, you know, you've sucked it dry kind of thing. And
expired, like,
So talking about sort of street activism, these videos that go viral, just making fun of me, like having a conversation and showing their stupidity. And you mentioned before, it's a bit of a circle jerk because their audience are primarily vegans now, and that's not a good thing that it's just like that, you know? I think there was a space for that for the past 4 years. That's been great at getting more people on board, but I agree that, I think it's run its course, and maybe it's time to evolve to make the next big platform of activism something else. But I guess, so that's where your marketing idea comes in, and these other ideas that you have.
Well, I think the whole idea is we fall into that trap of people calling vegans elitist. And I hate that term. I hate it so much.
White privilege.
Like this is elitism. Oh, you think you're better than me. And it's this whole concept of, well, no, I don't. I don't think I'm better than you. That's the point. I don't think I'm better than the animals that we're killing to eat. This is the whole point. The point I'm trying to get at is normality. What's normal. So the problem is I find that when you post a video that's calling out dumbness or the stupidity of certain people, you are kind of, look at that dumb person, look at that idiot, look at him, oh gosh, can you believe he argued plants have feelings too, what a moron. And you can fall into that trap that if that's the only videos that certain non-vegans are getting, they're going, oh, vegans are just dicks. So what is more effective? What's actually going to change minds? Now, how I went vegan originally wasn't for ethics. I did it completely selfish. I was a completely selfish prick. Like I was. Like I watched Forks Over Knives. I read the China study, and I was like, well, I read the China study. Forks Over Knives wasn't out yet, and I went for health. Then the ethics hit me like a ton of bricks. I went to a slaughterhouse. I went to a factory farm. I saw it. And I went, oh, I don't like this. But I was open to it because I'd already made the change for health. So I know though, if somebody had thrown blood on me and figuratively or yelled at me, I'm a stubborn person. I probably would have gone, screw you. So what might help me though is an effective marketing campaign that says, hey, this is Bruce. He's a truck driver with 5 kids, got a big bushy beard, and he's vegan. I go, wait a second, what's this? You're questioning the paradigm. You're sort of changing it. So that's sort of where I think that effective activism sort of falls, is in everyday people are vegan.
I like the idea of making it accessible to everyone, and not, even though I do that a lot, like this kind of is so fucking stupid, because that sort of works for me sometimes. But I understand, I also try and drive the message home that what we're trying to get people to understand is not an intellectual complex issue. Like not harming children is not something that's to be debated, you know what I mean?
Of course.
So even though it has the kind of intellectual elements, because I feel like that sort of works for me, I always try and drive the point home, this is an obligation that everybody has. So that's why I like your idea of a marketing agency. When we're thinking about what's going to create the most change, I didn't mention this to you before, but there is also this wider debate that always happens. Like I always have it with my research supervisor at USyd, and he's very focused on big structural changes, not individual consumerism. So he's interested in
foundational sort of stuff, or
foundational. And okay, so he takes the example of slavery, and it's annoying because there's not much I can say back to that, and he says that it's portrayed like it's romanticized almost in films that, you know, was the anti-abolition, it was the abolitionist activists that destroyed slavery and, you know, the 13th Amendment and all this kind of stuff. But actually slavery was no longer because people were moving away from agriculture, you know, farming, and basically capitalism happened and they didn't need slaves anymore. There was a big structural change. So that was the primary reason that slavery was abolished. And then those activists were like the moral backbone, pushing like, and it's wrong. Like, by the way, this is also wrong. It's not just impractical anymore. It's also just immoral. But when you look at the actual reasons, it was a big structural kind of change from the economy. So it went from agricultural land-based to capitalism. More cities started happening like, we don't need slaves, we need people working in offices and stuff like that.
That's actually a really interesting point.
It was a really good point. And when he said it to me, it was kind of a game changer in how I thought about activism. And even though I'll always be vegan and I'll always be a vegan activist telling people to stop consuming animal products, I understand a lot of the large-scale change that happens doesn't necessarily have its roots in ethics, if that makes sense. But then you could consider something like women's rights or, the black person's right to vote, and that was, of course, nothing was like influencing that. It wasn't like capitalism also made, you know what I mean? Like, so.
Very interesting, actually. This brings up a really interesting point. So, for instance, for me, the reason I stopped eating meat originally was because I didn't need it for sustenance anymore, because I saw that I could be healthy without it, right? Then that led me to the ethics. So let's take your example with slavery. It was the fundamental sort of idea of capitalism that sort of led to, wait a second, this is actually not ethical. Because as soon as it wasn't making money anymore, it's not ethical either. Because as soon as you start removing the sort of blinders of money, then that sort of moves. So for instance, like if you look at something like the growth of Beyond Meat, or we could talk about lab-grown meat, but let's just use that as an example. If that becomes viable, and you're telling me that if McDonald's can make a burger that tastes exactly the same and it's cheaper than agriculture, and government starts moving subsidies from farmers and farmers start moving into different fields, you're telling me that McDonald's wouldn't even flinch at saving 40 cents a burger or whatever it is? Give me a break. So then all of a sudden people start changing, and then their mind goes, well, if we don't need meat anymore, wait, the animals, oh my gosh. So that's actually a really interesting point that I haven't really thought about. Structural change can push, and then the animal rights can come later.
So this isn't like a popular or inspiring core message to say, but it's one that I consistently say because I think it's the most realistic, and a lot of change happens because of these structural reasons, not necessarily because people are good. And I don't think there's also this thing that's pushed. This is a side note, that people are inherently good and they want to be good.
Oh man, I disagree with that. I think that people are fundamentally selfish and bad. Is you the same on that?
I think
it's a very unpopular opinion, by the way.
It's more towards that. It's more towards the they're just nothing. They're just molded by what culture says they should be. Okay. And there's a small minority like me and you that can think for themselves, and we have to force them to be like how not force them, but do it in a way that they change, because they're just going to do what their society is doing.
Sheep.
You know what I mean? Sheep. Molded, manipulated, whatever. But so with this whole structural thing, I can kind of see it happening with environmentalism, climate change, and pandemics and health issues. So I think ultimately, and I've spoken to a lot of other like long-term activists, and they sort of think the same way, that those things are going to be the real
game changer.
And like what you said with Beyond Meat, that is a huge thing as well, because capitalism isn't going away anytime soon. Like, so we really need to be working within like that kind of mindset, especially for Western democracies. There's this whole thing about you can't be vegan if you're not anti-capitalist or whatever, but it's not a realistic way of thinking, like anarchists or challenging the man.
You can't be for women's rights unless you are left in every single thing. Like, come on, and this is such a frustrating point of view. Like, you don't kill animals. Okay, whatever your political leanings are, just don't kill animals. All right, just don't.
So controversial. Oh my god.
Oh my gosh, how controversial is that?
So I think it's a structural change, and then we have. It's a separate issue to what you're talking about. You're talking about individual kind of activism targeted at consumers. And I think that still is an important discussion to have, even though I think the big scale changes are going to come not from the type of activism that me and you do. Does that make sense? But I still think it's important to discuss, is it effective to throw blood on people? This kind of
Sure, but let's just quickly go back to that point, because one thing that I notice with vegans in particular, right, we freak out because there's certain level of helplessness. Now, everybody watching, helplessness is the worst feeling in the world. There's guilt, shame, and helplessness, because you just can't do anything. It's like when somebody passes away, you feel helpless, right? This gives me and long-term vegans who have been sort of looking at 50 billion animals getting killed yearly as hope. This is hope. People say it might not be sexy, and it's like, oh, not going out and throwing blood on people or whatever, these big viral videos that do things like Earthing Ed, but, or Gary Yourofsky or Joey Carbstrong. No, what's going to lead it is actually the market. That's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
So maybe what we should be focusing on individually is driving that innovation. I mean, it's doing it anyway.
Yeah.
But I notice a lot of vegans are against Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods. They're like, Whole Foods, like, shut up, all right? This is animals. This is for animals. Your health is your responsibility. It's your choice. The animals are like a victim in this route. You're not the victim, it's the animals.
I think what you were touching on there is having a sense of purpose. That's very important for longevity. Is this not what you were going with? So
I think for me, there is this certain level of appeal to futility.
Okay.
And the appeal to futility comes in and people go, well, what's the point? Why do I have to go out and not eat? Like, it's victimhood. Basically, all appeal to futility is if you listen to it and go, well, why does my friends go out to eat meat and I can't? It's not about you. This is the point. There's a victim involved. You stop giving your power away. It's a power thing. Once you retain your power and say, no, I could eat meat if I want to. I can go out and eat an animal, a dead body. I could right now, you and I, we can go to McDonald's right now and get an animal. But we choose not to. That's powerful. So that whole concept of appeal to futility slips in. Like, what's the point?
Yeah.
This sort of gives a little bit of hope, if anything.
Yeah.
But the point is, even if there was never going to be any structural change, even if this was going to be the reality forever, I still wouldn't eat meat because it's a value for me.
Yeah.
I feel like it's really sad if vegans say, well, if there's no point in ever changing, what's the point in doing this?
Yeah.
So that was kind of where I was getting at. This sort of large structural, from a capitalist perspective. Yeah. Imagine if capitalism saved animals. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, isn't that funny? Like, because people are so against like free market capitalism, we could discuss that in another video, but the point is, wouldn't it be funny if the demand drops? That's the only reason why that's why I'm not a huge fan of going and protesting farmers. Farmers are there because of the demand, right? Demand is what drives market. So if there's a huge demand behind a plant-based alternative or a lab-grown alternative, because McDonald's and these huge big corporations like Arby's even, or one of those Tyson Foods, all of a sudden they're investing heavily into the plant-based options. Yeah. It's expensive to grow the food, to move the food to animals, to raise animals, to then cart them off to slaughter. There's a huge labor intensive. If they can just completely
grow some plants and grow some meat,
it's so much easier. Yeah. So that's where I think a lot of our focus needs to be, and the normality of fuck your, excuse language, fuck your meat is manly advertising bullshit. Yeah. We need to like counteract that. Yeah. No, it's perfectly fine to be a man and be vegan. Yeah. In fact, it's admirable.
You did bring up a really good point that even if the world doesn't go vegan, which is a thing that we have to consider as well, you would still not harm animals. You just never question it. Like, rape's never going to stop. I'm not going to support rape. You know what I mean? It's a movement, but it's underpinned by universal values that shouldn't be infringed no matter what.
Yeah. There's a quote that I really love by John Stewart, which was, and I'm going to butcher it, but it was, if you don't hold your values when they're tested, they're not values, they're hobbies. Yeah. And I think that's so fantastic. Now, there's extremes to that, and you can push that to an extreme. Like, for instance, if you're in a survival situation, or if you're living on a desert island, which people like to put it, there are sort of extremes to that. But then you can talk about people who ate humans in those sorts of situations. But just generally speaking, if you go, oh my gosh, my friends are eating a burger, I had to do it, the social pressure, it's like, it's a hobby. You're virtue signaling. You're not actually in this for the right reasons. Yeah. So if I'm asking this question to the audience, if you pose that question, there's a chance that this would never ever change, that veganism will never ever take off and there'll always be animal suffering, because unfortunately, that's a huge possibility. Would you go back to eating meat? Then you've got to really question your values on this. So yeah, anyway, I think we never stop fighting. That's don't give up. It's not that futility, but it is something you really need to think about your values in.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a focused mind and you're dedicated, the futility thing doesn't even come into. I mean, if it has, whatever, you've overcome it, that's great. But it hasn't really come into mind because it's never been about. It is. We are trying to achieve a goal, but we're also just not harming others, which is just intrinsic to being a decent human being.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The Impossible Burger, when that
controversy.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I think this is a really interesting concept because, like, if people take medications that have been tested on animals, like, because the whole controversy with Impossibles was that they had to test on animals. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So people will just completely throw the baby out with the bathwater. I guess it's the cancel culture. Now, you ask yourself, what is the allowed amount of animal suffering for the greater good? So you can get into a really philosophical conversation, and you go like, did one animal suffer so billions can live? But we have to remember we're living in a very non-vegan world. We're living in certain parameters that we have to fulfill. So a life-changing medicine has to go through certain processes. My goal is that that's not a defense against impossible foods. That's a goal for veganism. It's like crop death. When somebody says, oh, do you know animals die in crops? That's not an argument against veganism. That's showing that we live in a non-vegan world. We need to get better. So yeah, the practices suck, and I'm not for it, but do you let it slide because that's the practices that we currently have? We have to shop in a supermarket, generally speaking. You have to give some form of animal exploitation in your everyday life. My phone, born out of pain and misery in a sweatshop in China, or the fact that there is actually animal products inside the phone. We still have to live in certain, there's to a certain extent. So I don't know. And my thing is, the greater good sort of comes into it, but then that's a philosophical question. Would love to talk about that another time though.
I think it blew up in a way that was, compared to other issues, unnecessary. I think I'm basically a consequentialist. Like philosophically, I care more about outcomes than about. I mean, I care about rights and things like that, but I think at the end of the day, I care about the actual outcome. And I think it's hard to have a proper opinion because you can't really base it on evidence or data or anything like that. But my understanding of the world is that if this burger, becomes a product, and it's going to do more good than it is by not having it. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at before about the cost benefits. It's
in a war situation. Like in a war situation, human life is sort of expended for the greater good. So needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Again, it's the trolley thing that gets bloody used. But the truth is, you got one chicken here versus, I mean, there was a huge debate about they took feathers for feathers off a bird for doing lab-grown meat. No animals were harmed. They took feathers, and there was a huge uproar because it's an animal product. I'm like, wait. I mean, here's a trolley situation for you. You got a feather on one side of the track, and you've got a billion animals on the other. I mean, there's your trolley situation. But this is where I'm open to discussions. If anybody wants to debate this with myself or you, I'm so excited about debating it because I can debate this for hours.
You should actually contact my friend Sonia. She's Sonia says she's on Instagram and stuff. She's very anti-IB, and I reckon she'd be up for having a debate or a discussion with you about it. She's quite convincing, but at the end of the day, ultimately, I'm, for better or for worse, I'm a very big picture, high level, consequentialist person, and I think that can lead to certain acts of unethicalness, or some people would perceive it as immoral, but at the end of the day, I think those decisions need to be made. Those big, is this going to outweigh the cost or the benefits? Someone has to make those decisions, so I can understand both sides, but ultimately I'm just eat the fucking burger. It's a vegan burger now. It's doing good in the world.
But we're still humans who do this every day. Drug trials happen every single day. Dangerous drug trials where people go in and they get paid, they get compensated, but they're still, and some who are given a placebo, which could be a potential life-saving medicine. So you go, we're making this consequential decision every single day with humans. So it's a really interesting sort of push-pull, but I don't think there's ever a black and white, right or wrong, ever. There's always grey, there's always going to be grey areas, and that's one of my video series that I like doing, is the grey areas of veganism, where you explore them, because there are. But yeah, the impossible foods thing, eat the impossible burger, let's end animal suffering. 82% of people who buy impossible burger are non-vegans, so there you go.
People looking in just be like, vegans are great, why are they obsessed with this kind of thing?
This is why I don't think veganism is a cult, because I've got a video coming out. It's taken me a long time to write it. It's going to be huge, but the whole thing is veganism a cult? And if you just need to go onto vegan Twitter or vegan YouTube or vegan Instagram for 2 days and see, no, we constantly are fighting amongst ourselves. This is not there's not one leader and we're hail the leader.
Such a good point,
So we are constantly trying to at each other's throats, but it's not a bad thing because we're constantly coming up with better ideas. For instance, the movement when I first started, no offense to anybody who was doing it, was raw. Raw was the thing. And I think that we've got enough evidence now to show that raw food diets are dumb. And if you're on a raw food diet, don't. They're dumb. I'm sorry. Unless you are really onto it, you're going to lead to health issues. You are going to potentially get fatty liver. There's all these sorts of issues. You need to add some sort of cooked food, generally speaking, of course. You might be
I have little to no opinions on diet.
Okay, cool.
Like, I'm willing.
But what I'm saying is, at the start, that's what it was. Now, what we're seeing is there is this whole growth of medical doctors who are joining the vegan community, who are saying, no, this is the way to eat. So constantly questioning the argument, you're going to get a better outcome. So that's why it's always good to have these discussions.
I think that's such a good point. It shows it's not a cult because there's so much fucking infighting. I'm like, how can it be a cult? A cult's like worshipping this one leader. This is just people arguing with each other all the time.
You want a cult? Like, go and look at the anti-vegan movements, man. God. They are the biggest cult I've ever seen because they're all in agreement with everything. Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's like this is pansita. Like, it's so funny. The vegan community is the furthest wrong. We might have a cult following like a movie, but there ain't no cult leaders here.
It's so funny. My friend George Martins did a video a while ago called "Veganism is not a religion, carnism is."
Yes.
He draws just so many comparisons between meat eating and religious societies. Like, it's a ritual basically, sitting around barbecuing animals, and like he makes a lot more like sophisticated points. I can't remember, but it's similar to what you're talking about here. Like, veganism is opposite. You're doing something completely different. You've made up your own mind about it. Like, you've done independent research. You can think for yourself. Basically, Thank you so much for coming by and coming on.
This is so cool. I got to come down to Sydney. I got to meet you, so it's great.
Let's get some lunch.
Let's go get some food.